Okay, and now comes time for our panel, and we're going to open this by allowing each of the presenters to make a very, very brief summary statement, just sort of a synopsis of their thoughts of the various themes that have been presented for the last 3 days here. And given the fact that Professor Kaleo and Nicholas White must leave at 11:30, we're going to start at that end of the table. And after each of them makes just a very, very brief summary statement or several statements, to open it up for questions from the audience. So, Professor Kaleo, if you'd...
Well, I think I will start by giving a good example and saying that there's too much to summarize, and I would much rather listen to the questions. I guess if I had to say something, it would be that in my talk, I tried to argue that there is a European way of looking at these problems of international governance, which is very different from ours, although nothing is ever fixed forever, and we may be moving toward, as Bob Hutchings in a way suggested, we may be moving toward a kind of consensus that we're very far away from one, but there may be some movement in that direction. The welfare state we talked a lot about yesterday, and we talked about all of its various problems. In my talk, I tried to say that the European way of trying to deal with these issues is what I described at one moment as mutual appeasement, conciliation, trying to structure a game so that it's not a question of winners and losers, but where everyone can find some kind of common interest. Dick Cooper made a very interesting comment, and we talked about it afterwards. Of course, from an economist's point of view, this is not optimal behavior. From an economist's point of view, it's important to have economic efficiency, and that involves one decision and not another. And I guess that is an important difference. And it's maybe something which does separate the two societies. Although I must say, in a place like Camden, it's maybe more European than we think, in the sense that the European view is that if you're a rich country, it's very important for people to have jobs. They're not very successful at this at the moment. But somehow the dignity of a job and something that somebody does in life is a value in itself, and that somehow or other, in reaching for economic efficiency, those values should not be thrown away, and that there are other values besides economic efficiency, and these things somehow have to be reconciled. And I think that is an important point. Anyway.
Thank you very much. Nicholas White.
Yeah, I think I'll build on that, and I have a couple of reactions to some things that other speakers said, and one question which unfortunately I won't be around to hear the answer to, so I hope people will tell me what the answer is. Building on what David says, I think the civilizational values that are expressed in the concept of Europeanness are at the core of all of this. And we tried to dance around it a bit yesterday with specifics on the money side and on the military side and on the ability to project external action efficiently. But that is not the core of what the European project is. The core is the shared civilizational values, and that's what shapes all of these arguments. And that's why sometimes there is a dialogue of the deaf across the Atlantic. I've always found it amusing that in America, when you table a resolution, you're actually removing it from the agenda, and in Britain, when you table it, you're actually putting it on the agenda. As somebody in my previous job, I had to edit a great number of texts written by Native American speakers, if that's the correct word. That was it's very weird, this kind of thing. A friend of mine who lives in Montreal she was puzzled because one of her novels had just been translated into German. and asked me if I could explain what the blurb on the novel said. She was not confident that the Germans had got it correct. And the blurb, as it happened, was perfectly appropriate, but she was startled to learn that the German translation was from the original American. As I said, she lives in Montreal, but she happens to be Welsh. More substantially, two quick reactions to other presentations. The debate about the European Constitution is an important one, but it's not the important one. The important one is the values question. And I differ from both John Gillingham and Ulrike Gero, who both took the view, I think, that the Constitution is of crucial importance. John taking very much the view that it will lead to disaster, and Ulrike taking the view that it will lead to triumph. I think they're both wrong. I rather share the view expressed by Bob Hutchings in the last session that this is an issue which will be sorted out one way or the other, but may not be sorted out as dramatically as some people on either side hope. I also think that, as I said earlier, if Croatia or some other country, say Iceland, decides they want to join the EU, the existing treaty blocks on expanding beyond 27 countries will be found not to matter too much. The question that I'm going to ask, which maybe you can even vary the order of speakers so that I can hear the answer. I'd very much like to hear Dimitri's view on the interlinkage between the frozen conflicts question, which Janusz was asked yesterday, about the settlement of the Moldova, Transnistria, and the Georgia, South Ossetia, and Georgia, Abkhazia conflicts. Partly what the Russian stake in those conflicts actually is. It's often caricatured as these being gangster puppet statelets propped up by Russian force of arms and criminal activities. I'm not sure that that is a good characterization, but it's how they're often described. And that then, of course, links into the debate about the future status of Kosovo, in which Russia also has a stake because it's part of the contact group and it's got a veto on the UN Security Council. So I'd be very interested to hear the answer, Dimitri's views on that. I'll just finish off by observing that I mentioned the contact group, the grouping of countries which has got together to sort out the Balkans, and this consists of this country, the Russian Federation, and the four big EU states, Britain, Germany, France, and Italy. It's worth reflecting that 100 years ago, the breakup of the Ottoman Empire was being handled also by 6 states. In fact, 5 of the 6 states are the same. And what has happened in the last 100 years is that we have lost Austria-Hungary and gained, if that is the word, the United States.
Dr. Bugash, in deference to Mr. Wright's request, would you be amenable to slightly altering the, Dimitri, not to catch you by surprise here, but just if we could switch the order just a little bit. Again, mindful of the fact that Nicholas White and Professor Kaleo must leave at 11:30 promptly.
Always been a Russia first, so.
Okay, so yeah, Dr. Trennan.
Well, thank you. What I'm taking away from Camden with me, apart from the most important thing, the good feelings, and really one of the most interesting and most warmest experiences so far that we've had in the United States, is that the issue of global governance is moving to the top of the U.S. and I would say the global agenda. That reformatting relations among the Cold War allies is a major priority. I think it's going to move up for the new administration in the United States. But I would also add here that a League of Democratic Nations, although this is necessary, is not yet a sufficient tool for reaching the goal of better global governance. And one needs to reach out to some other key players beyond Europe. Responding to Nicholas's question, I think that the areas of conflict, which are often referred to as frozen conflicts, are a very interesting issue and a very interesting reality. What we have is several unrecognized states which function as states. Not all of them, I would say, are puppets of the Russian Federation. When Russia tried to impose its own choice for president of Abkhazia, it was snubbed by the Abkhaz voters. They may not like the idea of returning to the Georgian rule, but they want to be independent. And that independence also includes independence from Moscow. We talk about Transnistria, and Transnistria, again, is a very interesting enclave. My wife and I recently been there, and it's a very interesting phenomenon. I was told that I would see the Soviet Union incarnate. In fact, it was anything but the Soviet Union. Money changes things profoundly. And it's a criminal-ridden enclave, no question about that. But it's a place where a few 100,000 people live. A lot of them carry passports of different countries. So you will have typically a person having 3 or 4 passports of Romania, Russia, Ukraine, Moldova, and yet they would be residents of this unrecognized place of Transnistria. There is a Russian stake out there. I would not overrate it, but I think that several of those conflicts could be eventually resolved through Russian-European-American collaboration along the lines of reaching a new deal between the central government in Chisinau and Tbilisi and the enclave itself. But in some other cases, I do not think we can hope for such a solution. Kosovo cannot be returned under Serbian control. Karabakh, we don't talk about Karabakh very much, but Karabakh is unlikely ever to live under Azerbaijani control. So we have very different outcomes for those cases. And let me say very finally, the stakes for Russia in Kosovo are minimal on the ground. There's not much of Russian presence in the Balkans left. But there's another stake. I think that the Russians would want to exclude a situation in which a group of foreign countries decide upon the borders of a state against that state's consent. And that, I think, is something that we need to think seriously about. There are cases within Europe and outside Europe which in many ways come close to some of those frozen conflicts. And we need to think seriously about not undermining something which has been one of the bulwarks of international stability.
Thank you. Dr. Bogosh.
Okay. I'll be extremely brief. I just have three very succinct points actually. First of all, I think what's become clear during the course of the conference is not only that the EU is a work in progress, but the interpretations of the EU are a work in progress. We've heard, I think, quite a lively debate on whether the European Union is a success or a failure. I think that sort of misses things a little bit, because any success brings new problems. And that's what the EU, I think, confronts. And the second point, in terms of what I spoke about yesterday, is how the expansion of the European Union, and inclusion of the Central European countries has actually enriched the European Union, not only in terms of bringing stability to a wider region, but also in terms of some of the solutions, some of the ideas that the new members will bring into trying to resolve the European Union as it evolves. In other words, with growth there come new problems. How to resolve those problems, I think these countries will have a major input, and I think that's for the good. And thirdly, to follow up what Bob Hutchings actually was saying this morning, hopefully our next administration, I don't think there's much time with this one, hopefully our next administration is going to focus much more on how to work with the European Union to engage, for example, as we have done in the Balkans, where there hasn't been really a major, since the intervention in Bosnia in the mid-90s, there hasn't really been a major rift between the US and the EU in terms of how to handle that region. And hopefully we can learn from that we can work together, whether using just hard power or hard and soft power, diplomacy, economic tools, in order to stabilize wider regions, neighborhoods of Europe and also beyond. So those are the three things I think I'd like to say.
Thank you, Dr. Lubensky.
Just very briefly, we've talked a lot about, in the last 2 days, about the enormous changes going on in Europe. And I think in the back of our minds these are taking place in the context of enormous global changes. And I would say a more profound set of changes than any that have taken place in the last, well, since at least the creation of the Western Alliance system back in 1949. So we're living through a real period of turbulence. And one thing that's changed is that toward the end of the Cold War in particular, I think one thing that was helpful was that the United States remained fairly steady as Europe was going through lots of changes. That's changed, and we are now in a situation post 9/11 where we too are in a period of soul-searching, redefinition, and I don't think we're by any means out of this yet. I don't think we've reached the final conclusion of how we are going to operate in a post-Cold War, globalized world characterized by an ongoing challenge of international terrorism.
Thank you. Dr. Clausen.
Yes, I would like to echo that. I think that when we look at the situation in Europe right now in a kind of broader, longer time perspective, it's clear that the collapse of the Soviet Union in 1989 was a tremendous movement that we had, a tremendous event we hadn't really understood what the consequences would be. And we have talked here about the rise of nationalism and the possibility of the rise of nationalism in the former Soviet Union. But I think it's worthwhile to look also at the rise of nationalism in Europe and its subterraneous minority movement, but it certainly is very much present. And in fact, I would argue that to some extent it's also even a reflection of the success of the European Union, because there is a very broad consensus in support of economic integration and intergovernmentalism on matters of economic coordination, much less popular support for the political project of the EU, and which is largely supported by the European elites. And the result of that has been a certain displacement of politics to cultural issues and identity issues. And of course, all of this is then fueled by the sudden realization that Europe has changed in terms of who actually lives in the territory. Europeans have not been used to migration to the extent that there was any discussion of migration. There was always a question about leaving and people leaving and going either to Canada, United States, or Australia. But that is what suddenly did change. In the mid-1980s, generations of earlier labor migrants decided that the myth of return was over, that they were never going to go back, and it was time to set down roots. And that actually became a push for integration. So ironically, all the conflicts that we are looking at today are matters of integration, to a very large extent, is actually the result of the desire on the part of immigrants to integrate. So I think it has been said here that many successes create their own problems. And in fact, integration is proceeding in Europe. So when there's a curious debate going on between Americans and Europeans right now, where Europeans look at Americans and decry the rise of faith-based politics. And Americans look at Europeans and decry the rise of xenophobia on the one hand, on the other hand, perhaps appeasement of Muslims. And in fact, I think neither of these stereotypes are in fact true. That they're marginal movements, but the core of what's going on is not nearly as dramatic.
Thank you very much, Dr. Clausen. Dr. Gillingham had the difficult task of launching our conference, and in the, I'll get to you in just a moment, and Dr.
I don't want to sink it at this point, you know.
The Russians have a saying, okay, and the saying is, I tell this to my students before their first examination, okay? And the Russian saying is, "Первый блин комом." The first pancake's always a mess. Okay? So the meaning is it's very, very difficult to get something started. So Dr. Gilligan had that very difficult task of launching this conference. With that in mind, we'll allow him a few moments to sum up things.
Well, I wouldn't liken my role at the end of the conference altogether to balance that of my beginning role, because I don't think I'm going to sink it, but it may capsize. Anyway, let me make a few summary remarks about the way I see the situation in Europe today, and a couple of still more brief ones about where I think it's going. I would say that the story that I have to tell in my books and here is one of a decline but not fall. I don't think the European Union is going to disappear, nor do I think it should disappear. I think it should be reformed to become more serviceable, and above all to become more democratic if it's going to have any hopes of developing into a political confederation. Now, the problems that it faces today are obvious. I won't go do more than tick them off. There are new problems with which it cannot cope because it is not properly designed to cope with them. This is not so much a criticism as it is an observation. There's a new relationship with Russia that grows out of energy dependence. There is a vast influx of immigration, both intra-European and extra-European, in terms of people seeking asylum nominally or seeking economic betterment in fact. There's also a protection from a problem with the rising neo-protectionism, which cuts across the spirit and the grain of the European Union. And we see it taking all kinds of different forms, in part being advanced by the increased external threat of energy dependence. And then finally, there's the challenge that the EU itself faces, which is structural reform, to alter its operating mechanisms so that they work better. This is quite a tall order, especially when you consider that it must be accomplished against a backdrop of slow economic growth caused by labor market inflexibility, has been emphasized, and an excessively heavy welfare state burden, and what is briefly called, described as demographic suicide. Obviously an overstatement, but you know by this time what we're talking about. Where can one find solutions? I agree with several of the speakers who have pointed out the inadequacy of existing institutional mechanisms as fora with which to manage the major problems we face in the transatlantic relationship, in the new global situation due to the rise of superpowers outside of Europe, and so on and so forth. But I would like to suggest that most of the solutions are going to come outside the realm of politics, diplomacy, and institutions, and through the economy. And I just point to certain phenomena. In spite of the rise of anti-Americanism, anti-Europeanism, this spiteful debate that really makes my ears ache, trade flows have increased between the United States and Europe over the last 10 years quite impressively and continue to do so. Financial relationships are ever closer. Vast new markets are being built, not European markets, American markets, but international markets, stock markets I'm talking about now essentially. We know about Euronext, the effort to take over the LSE by NASDAQ and so on and so forth. These are new communities of interest that are forming that tie us together even as intellectuals and politicians rip us apart. Okay. So there will be the solutions, when they come, will come, I think, probably through the economy. I can also point out to the rapid, unprecedented spread of new pace of technological diffusion in the world today, which brings us together in ways that are difficult to explain in a few words. The development of common business forms and common standards. And here I simply want to point out, I want to put in the first vote for Frau Merkel's new transatlantic initiative, which is very interesting. It draws from thinking, let's say, advanced thinking within the business community, and it's going to rest on standardization, right? Standardization of production standards, standardization of accounting standards, and so on and so forth. And this is a very quiet but impressive accomplishment. Above all, I'm not a black pessimist. Maybe in my worst moments, charcoal. But there is hope, and as an historian, I can draw it from the past. As several of the speakers have pointed out, the European Union seems always to be in a crisis. Well, that's true. Some crises are worse than others. But what I want to say once again is that in the history of the European Union, long periods of stagnation and even regression have alternated with those of astonishingly rapid progress. And there's no reason to expect that this cannot happen again if the biggest problem of all can be dealt with, and that's to restore the prestige of the European Union in the eyes of the European public, which, after all, is the main force and body concerned with its future. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Gillingham. After that last wisecrack, I sort of feel like John Kerry or something. You know? With all due respect, thank you very much, Dr. Gillingham. And your first presentation was certainly no mess, nor was this summation. So. Dr. Garrow.
Position in the lineup. I think I can be very brief too, and just perhaps make 3 final remarks. What I take with me from this conference, and that's really, I mean, for me, this is something that you can go into the middle of the United States and you can find 500 people that first are interested to spend 2 days on the European Union, and that second have a positive kind of interest in the European Union. I can take this home because this is something you do not always meet in Washington when you talk to policy circles first. So I can take home with me that there is an elite population difference, perhaps also in the United States, that makes that people could be much more positive towards the European Union than the administration sometimes seems to convey. And that is encouraging for me because I'm still a policy analyst and I try just to work on how to improve things. And so I just would kind of give back the thank you that I had from many of you to you, just because that's a very nice experience. The second point is that I think in average, everybody here on the panel, from Professor Hutchinson this morning to Kaleo, many people, and also the questions kind of, is the United Nations Security Council still appropriate? There were just the red line for me that we, 15 years after or 17 years after '89, we now finally realize that the world is no longer as it has been, and that there needs perhaps to be more fundamental changes in the way that the international system is structured, also the US-EU relationship or the transatlantic relationship, but broader also the whole international system. This is what I hear more often in policy discussions. We need to rethink NATO, the NATO-EU relationship, or the US-EU relationship, that the institutions we had have been designed for a past, that the United Nations Security Council still reflects power positions for the last century and not perhaps for the next century. And I think these are important things to work on. And my point here is, in a way, the following. Not only we need to reflect the transatlantic relationship, and for my personal thing, that's a hard thing to do, just because it's much about emotions. And I many times, when I try to think constructively how to shape the future between the US and the European Union, there's an immediate kind of swing that I'm anti-NATO or something, or anti-American, which I'm profoundly not. It's just so hard to kind of project yourself into a constructive future and giving up a sort of that nostalgia that tied us together for such a long time, and just to realize that the value set, or also the institutional set that we have, is perhaps no longer the most appropriate one. I was making this point on the NATO-EU relationship, but there is a point, and it came up in one of the panel discussions, or in a question, that if the European Union wants to be a little bit more, say, sovereign or autonomous, it's not that it is against the United States, it's just that at some point we want to be a little bit on our own and a little bit different. So that's not an anti-reaction. Neither the Euro nor the Constitution are an anti-reaction. It's just kind of, how can we shape our future? And I think it's not always easy to convey that, and at the end of the day to be constructive. So the last point I would like to make is that, and that's more the US and Europe in the 21st century. And here I would like to give one figure, which is that in 2050, the US and the European population combined will account for less than 7% of world population. And I think that's an interesting figure. It's an interesting figure because I do not believe, although I believe that both Europe and the US will still be important for quite a while, I do not believe that the other 73% of world population situation will allow us to spend 60% of the energy resources of the world, 60% of the agricultural production, 60% of water, and so on and so forth. So what I'm saying here is that the say, quote unquote, the West united, and if only Europe and US are united, the world is a better place, that I also think we need to get a little bit rid of that rhetoric. And one of the most fundamental things that we need to fix in the transatlantic relationship may well be that we need to consider how to give ownership to the rest of the world. And it comes down to really urgent policy questions, be it Iran, be it Iraq, be it all these hot spot policy issues where there is still a little tendency to think that we have the rules of the world and we just consider that the others should just behave like we want them to behave, or that we consider that we have the right to have things that the others do not have the right to have. And I do not think that we will go... And I think we won't go far with that, and it would need really an in-depth thinking how we move out of that in a moment where perhaps we still have ownership on the system and we could make it work for everybody. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Garreau. Our final commentator is Professor Richard Cooper has wisely distanced himself from the moderator. So,
I was asked to move to the left for technological
thank
reasons.
you, sir.
I want to make 3 points. The first is an obvious one, but somehow we all fall into habits of thought and we forget the obvious. We've talked a lot in this conference about the Europeans this and the Americans that. These are both tremendously diverse societies. I don't have to tell a group in Camden, Maine, how much diversity there is within the United States. On any issue, you choose it, you will find people in a room, this many people, you'll find many, many divergent and mutually incompatible views. The same is true of Europe. There is no European view on most issues. There may be a policy view coming out of an authoritative government or Brussels, but that reflects the convergence of, after lots and lots of debate, a final compromise. And so I like to imagine bell-shaped curves, and while it's true that the two, one for the Europeans and one for the Americans on any particular issue, and it's true that the peaks of the bell-shaped curves may not coincide, but they're not so far apart either. And there's a tremendous overlap in which there's a convergence of view between some Americans, many Americans, and many Europeans. I'll just take one example, which is outside my area of competence, so I'm sorry if I misspeak. I may be dated in what I say. That's capital punishment. And the generalization is the Europeans are against capital punishment. Americans favor capital punishment. It is true that the legal positions with respect to capital punishment differ significantly between the United States and Europe, Europe generally being opposed to it, and many American states entertaining it, at least under some circumstances. Public opinion polls suggest that opinion in Europe and opinion in the United States deeply divided on this issue on both sides of the Atlantic and not very different from one another. What is different is the mode of government. European countries have a parliamentary mode of government. When the government decides, the government in the British sense of the term, decides what it wants to do, Parliament votes. Whereas in this country, the president decides what he proposes to Congress, and Congress decides, and that's replicated, that process is replicated in the States. Very different decision-making processes. So two publics with essentially similar views can nonetheless result in substantial differences in policy outcome. And I just think we need to keep that in mind as we talk about the Europeans this and the Americans that. There's, at least in my world, I find myself arguing almost as much with Europeans to my right as Europeans to my left on any particular issue. Second point, I made it yesterday in my remarks. We've talked a lot about the European Union. I've watched it over the 50 years of its existence, and I don't want to underrate its importance. But what I do want to say is the European Union is not Europe. Most decisions in Europe are still made at the national level. And therefore, most problems have to be solved at the national level. May involve some international cooperation, and some of that may even take place in Brussels. But most decisions and the things that govern the lives of average European are decisions made at the national level, and we shouldn't forget that. One of the key issues in the European Constitution was the issue of competence. That is to say, what is the division of responsibility between the European capitals, national capitals, and Brussels, now representing not Belgium, but the European Union. And we had a discussion of the Constitution yesterday. This didn't come up, and I'm not clear in my own mind on it, sad to say, but my understanding is that the proposed Constitution, which has been rejected, shifted the competences, but only slightly, from capitals to Europe, and especially in two areas which are important, environmental policy and energy policy. There was an attempt, and there may be a third area which I'm forgetting, where the Constitution attempts to shift the competence slightly away from national capitals. The public debate on the Constitution did not bring these issues out clearly. I think the debate, as I observed it from across the Atlantic, on the substance of the issues was appalling, just appalling. And the average European didn't know what this Constitution was all about. It was about formal decision-making and competence in terms of its substance. But it wasn't clear. It wasn't put clearly. My third thing, I'm going to use this to push a policy proposal in which I think is one of hundreds of areas in which the U.S. and Europe could productively cooperate. Bob Hutchins was asked a question about climate change. He correctly said that the Kyoto Protocol is dead. I thought it was born dead. I think it's a ambitious proposal which cannot solve the problem and couldn't already in 1997. Why the Europeans have stuck so long to it, that's a separate story, complicated political story. But the real action in the next decade or two when it comes to global climate change is in China. China will build more coal-fired power plants than the US and Europe put together by a substantial margin, in spite of vigorous programs in China to move away from coal, to natural gas, to nuclear, to wind, and so forth. They're operating on all those fronts, but their power demands are growing so rapidly that by default, they're going to build lots and lots of coal-fired power plants. Once those plants come into existence, they will last for half a century. Every citizen of the world has an interest in those coal-fired plants and what happens to the CO2 that comes out of them. And my own view is that we're going to, again, by default, rely on coal more than we would like in the coming, at least for the next 2 decades. I think the answer, again, by default, is carbon capture and sequestration. And it's well known that it's much easier to build that into a plant from scratch than it is to retrofit. Terribly expensive to retrofit plants. There are several possible technologies. The US is working on many of them. We don't know which one will be the superior technology in the end and economical. China performs a natural field for experimentation. They are not going to pay the incremental costs, capital costs associated with building carbon capture and storage in from the beginning. My view is that the US especially is going to have to provide the technology. The US, the Europeans, and the Japanese should provide the incremental funding. We're not going to build power plants for China, but we should build in the global interest in these power plants. And I'd like to get that going as soon as possible, and I'm counting on your help to
Thank you very much, Professor Cooper. We have somewhere between 40 and 45 minutes for questions. Before it's opened up for questions, I would like to make just one additional observation. And that has to do with just the caliber of or the scholarly caliber of the panel that the Camden Conference has put together. As a Thank you very much for your applause. When you hear the following, you will probably want to applaud even more. So let me make this comment, that as a publishing academician myself, I'm very well aware of how much, just the immense amount of intellectual labor is involved in the publication of a scholarly article, and particularly a scholarly book. The wisecrack among social scientists is that political scientists aren't happy unless they're counting something, okay? And being a political scientist, I wanted to ply my trade, so I took upon myself to count up the number of books and the number of articles in aggregate produced by this distinguished panel here. And in aggregate, they have published somewhere between 55 and 60 books, depending on how one defines a book, and over 1,000 scholarly articles. So let's give them a hand for that.
Those trees.
So once again, thanks very much to the planning committee of the Camden Conference for doing such an outstanding job of bringing together such a distinguished panel. Thank you very much. We'll now open it up for questions. Several were submitted in written form, and I think it might be best to take the question up in the balcony first, and then I'll kind of weave these questions submitted in written form. But we have a question up in the balcony. Microphone number 3, please.
Good morning. I just want to say I thoroughly enjoyed each one of your presentations throughout the course of this weekend. My name is Jason Summer from Huntsville, Alabama. I'm an international studies student there, focusing on Russian relations. And this question is for Dr. Trennan. Dr. Kaleo, in his keynote speech, addressed the necessity of reciprocal appeasement as one of the diplomatic tools the EU must use when interacting with its allies and its partners if it wants to survive. Dr. Trennan, you alluded to the fact that Russia has taken on a cooperative theory based on good competition first. How do you see these two personalities interacting with each other in the next few decades as they're trying to define themselves?
Well, thank you for the question. Let me say that for Russia, the European Union is, above all, a model of how things could be done in a modern way so that people enjoy life better. When the word Europe is used in Russia, it's almost exclusively in a positive connotation. When you remodel your house, you remodel it in a European fashion, European way. One of the things that the Russian government is working very hard with the European Union is to allow more Russians to travel to the Union. That's a huge reversal from past Soviet practices. So Russia, from the Russian perspective, the European Union is a huge success story that we can also emulate in our own specific way. And eventually, in having engaged in this constructive competition, could catch up with the Union and construct life within Russia, which is decent. And we will. And at some point, when a Russian airplane arrives on the tarmac of an airport in Germany, a German policeman does not come up to the plane door itself to check the passports of the travelers. Russia, seen from the European Union, is a different story. I would say that Russia is more of a foreign policy challenge and a foreign policy opportunity for the Union. If and when the Union decides that it needs to have a different policy in the world that would make the Union an entity that would be able to peacefully and in a very friendly and cooperative and whatever fashion work alongside with the United States as a co-equal, then I think the issue of the Union's Russia policy could come up to the fore. So I think that if I were to summarize, Europe from Russia is about what Russia should do to make life better within Russia. Russia for the Union is a challenge and an opportunity almost wholly in the international relations sphere.
Microphone number 2, please. Question.
Ron Jarvella from Northport. Many of you have alluded to my question. Given the parameters of globalization and the interdependence that has resulted throughout the world of globalization, have we reached that happy point in time where it's more important for us to cooperate with each other than to compete with each other and vie with each other?
Ambassador Hutchings.
Sure, I'll try that one. One would hope so, but I think realistic. One has to look in this globalized world, and this has been alluded to by several speakers. This is a set of problems that affects every country, developed and underdeveloped or less developed, European countries, the United States. The pressures for protectionism are going to grow because in this globalized world, although more boats will be lifted, more will prosper in this world, the gap between haves and have-nots will grow larger. It'll grow larger between countries that are succeeding and countries that are not. It'll grow larger within countries, including within the United States. And this will create huge pressures. Someone made the important observation, it may have been Dick Cooper, that we ought to think about protecting workers, not their jobs, that the jobs, these are going to be lost. I mean, many of these jobs that we associate with advanced industrial democracies are going to go offshore. We worry about tax preparation jobs going to India. Well, in a few years' time, the Indians will have offshored, outsourced these jobs somewhere else, these menial jobs. They'll keep moving up the skill ladders to take over jobs that we associated with the OECD countries. The point is not to hang on to those jobs. The point is to prepare our population for the new and better jobs of the 21st century while protecting those segments of societies, those families, those workers who are most severely disadvantaged. I think it's a bigger challenge as a global management problem, and Dick Cooper is vastly more knowledgeable about this area than I am, than governments have so far really acknowledged, that we need to meet this challenge and fashion a global trading system that will be flexible enough to work out to the future, or the happy situation you described will fall victim to energy competition, resource competition, and protectionism.
Dr. Cooper, would you care to?
Yeah, I just want to make the generic point that I actually don't see cooperation and competition as opposites. I see them as complementary, and we need both, and we have to be attentive and careful about where we apply each of them. There are some areas where cooperation, in order to move to a efficient, viable solution, is absolutely necessary, but there are other areas in which competition is healthy and desirable. So I just want to signal that the question needs to be parsed much more carefully. These are not opposite concepts; they are complementary concepts.
Thank you very much, Dr. Cooper. It's been requested that we have an avalanche of questions, and if we could kindly ask the panel to be as brief and succinct and concise as possible with responses. Microphone number 2, this gentleman in the front.
Lenny Nelson from Falmouth. This is a vocabulary question. Most of us in the room are Americans. We know the American Constitution pretty well. We knew it took a few years, around 1776 to 89, to happen. But it was 13 colonies, everyone spoke English, or mostly English. The European Union, as you've described it, is 27 countries speaking around 20 languages or more. You call it a union. In America, we think of a union as Lincoln saved the Union. And we as Americans think of a union perhaps in a very different way from the European Union. My vocabulary question is it really a union or is it a joint venture?
Is there a specific panelist to whom you would address that?
Whoever you choose.
Well, Dr. Garreau and then Dr. Gillingham.
Okay.
Language matters. And it's I'm not going to say it's a weak point, just because there's so much cultural richesse in having all these languages, so nobody wants to skip them off. But in terms of how you organize a democracy, how you make power positions clear, how you get people interested in what happens in Brussels, language is indeed a problem. So we run Brussels in a way with English being lingua franca, everybody speaking these 2,000 word English that I also pretend to speak. It's a shame for your language, which is much more beautiful. So yes, I mean, there's nothing to add. We won't go for a single language. Still, I think, and this is perhaps the answer to your question, the goal is not to go for a single language. It gives problem to organize democracy and media, because you cannot draw media attention to Brussels. Or if you want to organize a democracy and say we were running with the Finnish president as being the president of the European Commission, and this guy would need to speak to 27 radio or TV stations in 27 countries being translated, it would not give you the stomach feeling that that is your president. So yes, there is this problem. On the other hand, I think what the European Union is about is variable identities, which is being German and European. And I think what is biased in the discussion is that in the policy system, it often works like Brussels did this and that, and we German didn't want it. The reality is that most of the time in these cases, the German government voted for what has been voted, and the Germans did only not realize it. And so you create a gap between this is Brussels and this is us. The true answer is we are the European Union. Every citizen in the EU is EU as much as he is French or Dutch or German. So I guess that's an additional asset of the European Union as much as it is an additional complexity. Does this prevent us from being a union? Ultimately, I think not, because there's a value system that everybody in the EU, I think, feels, and feels much more the moment he's outside of the EU than inside.
Dr. Gillingham.
Well, I think that was a time bomb. It's an extremely astute question, but very hard to ask. I would begin by saying that any notion of a federal union as an analog to the American one would be not only premature, but probably not consistent with what Federalist Europeans want. And Ulrika has mentioned the notion of a secondary citizenship, or dual loyalties, or complementary loyalties, that the two, loyalty to a nation state and loyalty to a higher or larger, broader structure of Europe, are not necessarily contradictory and can be combined. But how can they be combined? And that's where the vocabulary comes back into it again. Nobody really knows for sure. They can be combined when it comes down to the issue of national or transnational loyalty. Then values are often brought into it. A German philosopher, Jürgen Habermas, has talked about constitutional loyalties. That is to say, those fundamental core values that one needs to create some form of common political organization. I think there's a lot to be said for that, but I don't think it's. I think it's an idea still very much in gestation if one tries to apply it to practical politics. There's a new theory out that. Well, let me put it this way. One other point is that the notion that it is going to become a federal state presupposes a certain view of history. I don't accept that view of history. I say there are all kinds of possible outcomes. The future of Europe could very well be something closer to a German Staatenbund than to a Bundesstaat. It could be a league of states, or it could be simply a treaty-based organization based on common interests wherever they may exist or may be found. We could have a network organization instead of having a single structure, institutional structure, political in character, and Europe wouldn't come apart. The point is that over time, all these possibilities have been open. I mean, the EU has been refractory, that is, it doesn't change, mutable, that is, it does change, and polymorphous, and it takes many forms, and this is possible in the future as well. But for the present, I don't think we're going to see too much development. For a number of years, the EU appears to be going into hibernation.
Thank you, Dr. Gillingham. We have a question from Rockland, and then we also have actually several questions, of which we'll take one from a gentleman from Milwaukee, Wisconsin. I do want to recognize this gentleman and his question after we take the question from Rockland. The question from Rockland is, how may the U.S. restore its reputation in the eyes of Europe? Kimball Mason, Freeport, Maine. Dare I call upon a particular panelist to, perhaps Dr. Clausen, would you care to initiate the discussion on this?
There is a large reservoir of goodwill for the United States in Europe. In my work and interviews with Muslims, I was often encounter people who said, we know Americans are X, Y, and Z tolerant, good thinking people, do not have problems with us Muslims, but we don't like your government. So I think that it is important to recognize that what's going on right now is a very acute conflict over political objectives. And even more perhaps not so much the grand objectives, but means. I take a pretty calm view of it. I think in another 5 years, we might not need to ask that question anymore.
If we could ask Dr. Trennan to comment on that, we'll adopt a particularly capacious definition of Europe and include Russia, and call upon Dr. Trennan to offer commentary in response to this question, if he would be so kind.
Well, thank you, Jim, for your attempt at enlarging Europe still further. I don't think that there's a problem with the U.S. reputation as a nation in Russia. I think it has a stellar reputation, and it's not in danger. And we discussed that as to the reputation of U.S. foreign policy. I think that this is something that's been discussed in this country, and I'm sure that this country has a tremendous capacity for correcting mistakes which it sees, and that's something that we place our faith in.
Ambassador, Ambassador Hutchins.
Just very briefly, I think it would be nice to believe that the problem is with American policies, and as soon as we change the policies, we'll go back to the day when everybody loves us around the world. I think we got a more fundamental problem than that, and the Pew Research Institute has been doing a lot of global surveys, and they're really interesting data. And what they show over time is that, opinions of the United States have gone up and down. You know, they were down during the Vietnam War, they were up in other periods, and they fluctuate with policies. What is new is a global trend toward disapproval of the United States itself, not just its policies. And I think, we Americans would be wise to take a hard look at that and a hard look at ourselves. And not to say that we're the root of all the problems around the world, but there's something going on about the behavior of our country in the last few years that has given rise to a great deal of opposition, animosity, not just from adversaries, but also from friends.
Thank you, Ambassador Hutchins. We'll take the question from the individual from Milwaukee, Wisconsin, after we take the question from the auditorium here. Microphone number 2, please.
Spence Hurt, Tennant's Harbor. This is a question for the panel at large. What impact, if any, might China have on the final formation of the EU?
Thank you.
China, last member.
Dr. Bugajski.
China and EU. Okay, let me be forward-looking. I propose Chinese membership of the EU. No, clearly there will be an impact. I'm not an economist, but in terms of economic competition, in terms of demographics, in the security arena, the question, of course, is how Europe can work with the United States to ensure stability in Central Asia, Far East, areas that are of primary concern also to China. So in all these areas, again, it's a subject vis-à-vis China that we should be working together on.
Thank you. Certainly the question of China's rising energy needs will play very strongly into this. And Dr. Cooper, would you care to perhaps offer a comment to that?
There's always a question of how large the framework one tries to answer these questions is. China is a new, dramatic, exciting phenomenon on the world scene. It is growing very rapidly in trade terms. It's having an impact wherever it trades, which is every place in the world, including Africa. China's had more of an impact on Africa than anyone else in the last few years. And it happens, I wrote a paper on Sino-European relations several years ago, and I was struck by how little attention Europeans were giving to China compared with the attention given in the United States at that time. But I could also observe at that time that China was just passing Belgium in terms of its level of trade. China has now reached Japan, exceeded Japan in its level of trade, and even the Europeans have noticed that. And so if the Europeans play their cards right, I think they will see China as a challenge in order to increase European cooperation in dealing with the various challenges that China poses, mostly in the economic area. So I see it as a potentially positive force in that sense.
Thank you. Dr. Gilligan.
Yeah, just to add a point. It's very difficult to say anything about this situation because it is historically unprecedented. I mean, China has never aspired to becoming a global power, but a dominant regional power. Now, whether this will change or not, we can't know. But we shouldn't necessarily assume that it will. Chinese have been very, very guarded about asserting political power. The theme for their policy for a long time was peaceful rise. Now, this may just be because they don't want to scare anybody, but it may also mean that they don't share Western notions of great power status. I don't know. The other thing I want to point out is that anything that's said about China is subject to contradiction tomorrow. Something like 17,000 unofficial local uprisings occur per year. And one cannot automatically assume that tomorrow's China will be unified. The government in Beijing is deeply concerned about this possibility, especially in connection with some sort of problems on the Chinese borderlands in Central Europe or with the Taiwan question. So they're really speaking a different language with a different set of concerns, as they should. They have to, because they face a different set of givens. But once you get past the idea of China joining a global world order, you should discuss India. Not only has India never been, a great power, its modern history is that of being a colonial dependent. So when you put these two new elements into the equation, the only thing I can say in a modest way is to echo Professor Cooper's comments. It's time for us to shut up and learn.
Well, we should now take the question from Milwaukee, the individual from Milwaukee, Wisconsin, Delos Lutton. And this question, I think, would be probably most appropriately addressed by Ambassador Hutchings. The question is, what will Europe do and what should it do? Underscore should. What should it do if Iran continues its uranium enrichment program despite any sanctions that may be imposed? So.
Yeah, well, I think what it should do, actually, I'll echo my new Princeton colleague, Joschka Fischer, the former German foreign minister, who's got strong and I think pretty sensible views on the subject. I think he's made the strong case that Europe ought to be prepared to not only support but encourage severe economic sanctions. This is a way of bridging the gap between the worry that the United States administration may be willing to use military force, and the Europeans may not be willing to do anything, that the bargain that should be struck is a joint willingness to use economic sanctions that would actually stick. I mean, bearing in mind that Iran is not North Korea, this is a parliamentary system. It is half democratic, half authoritarian. It's got lots of interests that are manifest, and there are points of leverage with the Iranians that don't exist, at least so easily, with the North Koreans. So this would be, I think, what both sides ought to work for is a common position with, of course, Russia on board as well, to, if Iran takes that step, to be prepared to do something serious. And I should say, on the American side, this would include a ironclad assurance to the Europeans, not publicly, but to the Europeans, that we won't use military force.
Thank you very much, Ambassador Hutchins. We now have a question from Rockland, and then a question from the auditorium, but let's take those in this order. The question from Rockland, the phrase, quote, lack of imagination, close quote, as it has been applied to 9/11 continues to haunt me. In light of this weekend's discussion, what are we failing to imagine? Barry Pribble from Rockport, Maine. Lack of imagination. Does anyone on the panel want to?
Well, I'll take a stab at it.
Thompson and then.
I think that now we do have the imagination, but we were failing to understand the intentions of Al-Qaeda and how that sort of political activism worked, to put it very mildly, because it was quite clearly the case that Al-Qaeda represents a new political phenomenon. If you compare Al-Qaeda terrorism to other types of terrorism, one of the big differences is the focus on highly symbolic targets, like the World Trade Center, and the Pentagon. But you also look at what Al-Qaeda in Europe has been aiming to do in terms of blowing up trains and hitting the infrastructure. These are not military strategic targets. So Al-Qaeda represents a new movement and a new version of suicide terrorism and terrorism in general. Not all Al-Qaeda terrorism is directly suicide terrorism. Some of it is aiming at assassinations. And the most recent plot in Britain was an intention to kidnap a Muslim soldier in the British Army and execute him and put the execution on the internet, on YouTube. And I really, frankly, this is something that people have been imagining. We have been quite aware that these sorts of attacks and symbolic events were very forthcoming. The question is what you do. I mean, that's a bit more complicated. How do you? But in fact, I think counterterrorism strategies are becoming increasingly more effective. And we see that in part because more and more plots and conspiracies are revealed before they take place. So I'm not sure that this is really a problem of lack of imagination anymore, but I would be interested in hearing what Ambassador Hutchinson would say.
I'll be very, very brief, but I think I have used the term. I use it sometimes because that's one way of getting at my former colleagues in Washington. They don't like to be called accused of lack of imagination. I think where I have come from is that a recent national intelligence estimate published a few months ago and then promptly leaked, and then had the key judgments declassified, so they're all available to be read, said that the jihadist threat is spreading and intensifying. And this, almost 6 years after 9/11, I take as about as severe an indictment of American approaches after 9/11 as one could imagine. If the threat is getting worse, after all this expenditure of blood and treasure, what are we doing? What's wrong with the model in which for every terrorist we kill or capture, 10 more rise up to take their place? So the imagination I'd like to see is to go beyond the misguided war metaphor to use military force, of course, as an element of counterterrorism strategy, but to think of this as a much broader generational challenge that is going to require cross-cultural, economic development assistance, public diplomacy in the old-fashioned sense, where we really spent some time and imagination developing long-term programs, political engagement in the region, and all these elements, I think we have to put in place. So that's the kind of imagination I was looking for. Thank you.
Before we take our next question at microphone number 1, Professor Cooper, would you?
Well, I was going to make a different kind of point altogether. It doesn't disagree with what Bob just said, but we don't have any lack of imagination in this country. In fact, we have a remarkable number of incentives, whether it's writing science fiction novels or discovering new chemicals or whatever. We have a lot of incentives for people to be innovative and imaginative. The problem, I think, implicit in the question is, how do you get relevantly the attention of the senior political figures of the United States in a form that leads to, in the context of the question asked, preventative action? And I frankly don't want our leaders to be worrying about all possible outcomes. We have enough serious known problems. I want them to spend most of their attention on their known problems. I want a very robust intelligence system which alerts us to potential problems and gets their attention. We incidentally had such a system, and it's the senior officials didn't pay as much attention to it as they should do. For those of you who are interested, there's a fascinating now ancient history study of the attack on Pearl Harbor, where exactly the same question was asked, and in fact Roosevelt was accused of engaging in a conspiracy implicitly with the Japanese against the American public to get Japan into the war. There's no evidence whatsoever for that. Roberta Wohlstetter looked through all of the intelligence after it was declassified and has an absolutely marvelous study of essentially how do you pick the right needle out of a very big haystack. And so I think the issue is filtering and attention. And the one thing we can say about our political leaders, and I include Europeans and Japanese they don't have more than 24 hours of the day, just like us normal folks. And they need to put their attention to issues that they know are important, not potentially important issues. There are too many of them. And only a few of them will mature, and we'll have some disasters from time to time, and that's life. That's my own view.
Okay. Dr.
Let me just very briefly, that
inevitably,
I think in open democracies we're going to be vulnerable. Whatever checks, whatever precautions we take, there's always that chance that something will slip through. But we have a choice. We can either live in a vulnerable, open democracy or a very safe police state. And quite frankly, I'd rather have the former.
Thank you. The question at microphone number 1.
Greg Russell from Troy, Maine. And speaking of known problems, I'd like to get back to global warming for just a moment. Global warming has the potential to trump everything that we've been talking about up to this point. It affects everything: water, immigration, economy, agriculture, trade, politics, and much, much more. I was wondering, and this is for the whole panel, what sort of solutions are coming out of Europe and Russia to deal with the problem? Some sort of creative policies to deal with the problem, and also the effects. What happens when you have massive immigration or you have desertification? What is being planned in Europe and Russia for this?
Very good question. Thank you very much. The German Marshall Fund, or some of the statistics I saw from that indicated, if I read them correctly, that one of the points of disappointment among European public about the European Union has been this perception of a failure to address these kind of questions. So, and again, perhaps I misread it, but in any case, I'd ask Dr. Garreau to start off our discussion of this.
I mean, global warming is a rather new policy topic, and it came very sharply on the policy agenda. It's now the top priority of the G8 agenda. I think that Mrs. Merkel is really committed to get results. I think that much of it stemmed actually from the British, and that Blair has been, I mean, for those who observed it, but the United Kingdom had a large debate about global warming, and Blair was certainly the driving force to get that on top of the EU agenda and on the top of the G8 agenda. What will be the outcome, and how do we do that with China and with other countries being, say, more on a we defend our national interest stand here? I mean, what you hear if you're in Beijing is basically that they say, look, I mean, we need to catch up with 40 years of development, so please give us the freedom to do so because you had it. That's, from a Chinese standpoint, probably something one can understand, although we would like to have other solutions. So here's my point. I think that it will probably more go over market solutions, trading systems, and this kind of things, which the European Union is already established. We do have trading systems for power plants and so on and so forth. So we are probably increasing these policies that are market-driven, and I think they are most likely to be more successful than policy initiatives, not saying that the latters are not needed. But the point with climate protection, as with many of those big global goals, is that the trade-off between short-term cost and long-term benefits is just so far away that if you want to make them happen into an electoral constraint system, you would need to make everybody agree that we are ready to pay, as of today, huge cost. And this is normally something that no political leader wants to do, because if I tell you that your gasoline will cost $10 a liter tomorrow, you wouldn't be so happy, nor would I. So all these are questions, how can we translate long-term goals into very short-term high costs into political systems with the electoral constraints mechanism here. And in a way, this is why I argue that probably the market will driving to fix that.
Thank you very much. Dr. Cooper.
There are only three ways to deal with global warming. One is to ignore it and adapt to whatever changes that take place. Remember, this is not going to be a change that takes place between this year and next. People are talking, the horizon that we're using in this area is much longer than we normally do for public policy. We're talking about the next century. Human beings are an enormously adaptive species, and I have no doubt that throughout, you just look at parts of the world today where people live and the range of, that people live in, there's no doubt in my mind that human beings will adapt to whatever climate change takes place. So that's one strategy. A second strategy is to invest a lot in R&D and hope that we find a silver bullet. There is no prospect at the moment, none, for a silver bullet, but we can hope and we can put a lot of money into R&D, and that is implicitly has been the U.S. strategy. It was implicitly the Clinton strategy. No one would say it just as bluntly as I've said it. It's implicitly the strategy of the Bush administration. And the third possibility, which gets to Ulrich's point, is to raise prices. We are the culprits. We're the ones who make decisions. Everyone in this room, firms and households, who make decisions about consuming energy. How do you influence the behavior of 6.5 billion people? You do it by raising prices of the offending activity. And nobody wants to hear that, and no politician, therefore, wants to say it. I take a modest credit. Al Gore, finally, when he published An Inconvenient Truth, has a little bit of public policy at the end. Up until that time, it was a call for action without telling us what the action should be. And we need to recognize it is an inconvenient truth. If we want to take this seriously now, we don't have to pay an arm and a leg. We can do it modestly, but we have to start. And we need to have a public discussion on that. Now, when it comes to European policies, I'm going to be very harsh. Europe has a very strong declaratory policy on the issue of global climate change, and with the exception of a few countries, the content of the policy is largely empty. They do have a trading system, which they started a year and a half ago, and all of the countries allocated so many emission permits that the initial price, which the market was guessing, fell to 2/3 of its earlier level. So the price on the market is negligible now because of the over-emission of permits. This is a very tricky issue, but I think the public at large needs to understand the fundamental choices, and they are, as I say, do nothing, hope, put money into research, and hope for something to come out. And I'm a technological optimist. Perhaps in 30 years something will come out, but there's nothing we can see in the pipeline now that solves this problem. And the other is we've got to pay more, starting now, and we have to recognize it. I have a proposal on this issue, which is for a global carbon tax. Chinese will pay it, I'm sure, if everyone else pays it. And I know I have one set of allies around the world, maybe only one, but one set, they're important, ministers of finance. They all need the revenue.
Thank you. It's come to our attention that the offending noise is coming from someone's BlackBerry. So we have an offending BlackBerry in the auditorium that is turned on. So if whoever has the offending BlackBerry could kindly turn it off. Thank you. We have 36 seconds, 34 right now. We have a backlog of questions. We'll take question number 2, and we would ask that it be brief and ask the response be brief. Then we'll take a question from our friends in Rockland, and with that, we'll close the question and answer session. Microphone number 2, please.
Jean Matlack from Rockport. Dr. Trennan, I'd like to ask you to pull one needle out of the haystack about the deconstruction of the Cold War and talk to us about the nuclear warheads that remain from the period of intense armament and what the situation is with them.
Thank you.
Well, unfortunately, it's the inconvenient truth that those warheads are still there. And we don't think of them the way we used to think about them during the days of the Cold War. But this is a legacy that I think we need to focus on. And 2009, 2012 will mark the end of the current arms control regime. I think we need to put our heads together to think ahead so that the 21st century does not produce something that we managed to avoid in the 20th century. And this time, it's not going to be just the United States and Russia. It's also going to be China. It's also going to be some other nations. So this is not an issue that we can safely just shelve. This is something that we need to focus on.
Thank you very much. We have a question from Rockland. That will be the final question that we'll be able to take. Then we have closing comments from Camden Conference President Banwell. So let's take the final question. With respect to Maine's clear manufacturing background, what initiatives or direction do you think Maine could take to actively participate in a more global market?
Join the European Union?
Join the European Union, perhaps? If we may conscript Dr. Cooper to address this question.
Well, there's one strategy which some Mainers have elected for many decades now is immigration. Another strategy, which I had a very interesting dinner table conversation last night, is go the R&D route. Maine has some distinctive geographic advantages, and they have not been exploited maximally. There is potential out there for developing, for example, forestry is a natural, has been historic Maine industry. Forestry is very far from dead, even in the world of modern plastics and other materials. Combinations of forest products with chemical materials can produce marvelous new building materials, furniture materials, and so forth. The fishing industry, which is the reason Maine really exists. There was a time, I mean, as a human settlement, there was a time in which the Grand Banks was the richest fishery in the world. You have stories dating from the early 16th century about how you could put your hand in the water and come up with not one but two fish. We have squandered that resource. That's the only way to describe it. We and the Canadians, with some help from the Spanish and the Portuguese and the Russians, who fished in these waters, we've squandered that resource. We're in the process of rebuilding it. Have been following ocean fisheries for years due to some peculiar interests, and I'm very pessimistic about our mankind's ability to revive the wealth that the oceans have provided us. I think the Chinese are providing the answer, and the Norwegians and others, maybe even in Maine, I don't know about it, which is aquaculture. We're going, just as we moved from hunters and gatherers on land to settled agriculture, we're going to have to make the similar movement when it comes to fisheries. And I learned last night that there's some interesting experiments with halibut going on, for example, at the University of Maine. And so I think the answer is, which has been a theme that's run through this subtly, is new ideas, new applications of intelligence to old problems.
Thank you, Dr. Kuba.